future-wise for American democracy, I mean, I don't want to sound like an alarmist, but I kind of agree with you. I think you'll know a lot more about the future of American democracy in a month.
Yeah.
I think, not to be like every election is the most important election of your life, but this one is like, I think
it's up there.
It's up there.
Hello, guys. Welcome to our most recent episode of Discourse Debrief. I believe this is 6 now, right?
6. Yep.
Holy hell, 6th episode. But yes, back at it. We're recording this, October 21st, so it's been some time since our last one. But we do have some events on the horizon. Once this ends up being uploaded, we will have just had our first big on-campus event with Joanna Maska and Sean Spicer doing a debate about voting in a very tumultuous voting season, but that'll be up there, hopefully really good content there. In the near future, on election night, some of our team will be out on Northern Florida University campus, I believe it's called, right?
Something like that.
But that's going to be a really fun one because it's happening on election night, talking about politics and whatnot, so hopefully that'll be entertaining, if not educational. And then we have other things coming as the semester starts to wrap up. I mean, we're nearly halfway in, if not more now, which is kind of crazy for me to believe, but yeah, today this is a Logan topic episode, so he has chosen a topic. But firstly, as you may have noticed on our other camera, we do have another guest with us today. Mac, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mac Adkins. I'm a poli-sci major here at U of A. I kind of got into this sort of by accident.
Yep.
Ted just was like, hey, do you want to do this? And I was like, sure, why not? So I kind of going into this a little blind, watched a couple of the episodes, but yeah, just here to have a good time.
Yeah, Ted, our supervisor, just kind of reached out to me and Peyton was like, hey, is it all right if I kind of send you a couple of my students? We're like, yeah, whatever, that sounds fine. Always, appreciate a third opinion. So, yeah, we're glad you could be on.
I'm glad to be here.
Well,
all right.
What are we doing today, Logan?
Okay, so the topic today is democracy and capitalism.
Oh.
I've had some great arguments, mostly online, because people love to argue online, about this topic, so I thought I'd bring it here. So let's just start off. Let's go around and kind of give your definitions of democracy and capitalism and kind of what they mean to you.
Okay.
And Peyton, we'll start with you.
Sure. I hate terms because I don't know the official definitions. I'm going to sound like an idiot. To me, democracy is, broadly speaking, this idea of a system of government that incorporates the input of everyone that it's affecting, or its citizens. So we're talking voting, we're talking equal representation, we're talking liberty for all, these kinds of things. The kind of government that does its very best to fairly incorporate everyone's opinion such that everyone is fairly respected. Capitalism, money. Economics is definitely a weaker place for me, but this idea of there being capital that has value, and through exchanging your capital with other people's capital, you would kind of end up happier, unless there's a finite amount of capital, which there inevitably will be, and then there will inevitably be people who are lesser off. But yeah, capital exchange for capital is my broad understanding.
Sure. Mac?
Democracy-wise, again, kind of the same thing. I'm not super great at book definitions, but to me that doesn't really matter because I feel like words should be defined by how we perceive them, not by how we write them down.
Based.
But democracy, I don't want to say rule of the masses because that's really reductive. But when more people have a say in government than not, I guess is probably the easiest way to put that.
Okay.
And capitalism is the accumulation of capital by a certain class of people, because to say everybody can accumulate capital would be kind of impossible. That's not really how capitalism works, but a system of economics that usually bleeds into government where capital is gained and certain people work for capital.
Okay. So democracy for me, just from an is it etymological?
Yes.
Etymology?
Yeah, it sounds right.
Dem, people, and then ocracy is like obviously like rule of. So the people kind of decide the laws. Since obviously we're talking from a U.S. standpoint, the U.S. is kind of like a mixed democracy. It's like what's the exact? We're like a constitutional republic or something like that.
Yeah.
But we're also like democratic. I guess functions. I don't know how you would call that. So yeah, that just to me means the people kind of have a say in their government, in their laws, in their processes, and usually that's through a vote of some sort. Capitalism to me, that just means the people kind of, well, like, I don't want to say free market because we're not a free market. We have obviously restrictions and regulations and such. So I wouldn't say free market necessarily. I guess I would kind of agree with your guys' definitions as like the people have the means by which to attain capital by creating some sort of value and then exchanging that for a currency, in this case the dollar. And that to me is just capitalism. I guess I'm going to kind of disagree with you, Mac. You said, not everyone can attain capital. I would say everyone can. I would say not everyone will.
I was using, this is going to maybe expose my education a little bit. I was using the capital in sort of the, I don't want to say Marxian, but that's probably the best touch point of like, not money, but like money making.
Okay.
Like only a certain number of people can like own a factory, but
Sure.
a lot of people can work at a factory. I was
Yeah,
using capital
absolutely.
in that more
Okay.
like
Gotcha.
accumulation sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like obviously as technology advances, that number will continuously go down.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's start with the democracy standpoint. And Peyton, you're gonna love me for this. The first kind of lens I want to look through this is from a philosophical point. So Plato, you guys are all familiar with Plato, right?
Less than I should be, but yes.
Okay, well, it'll be good enough. So Plato was an Athens native. Athens is commonly referred to as the first sort of pseudo-democracy that we know of. And Plato was actually kind of the first real critic of democracy. So his definition of justice was sort of the people do as they are best equipped to do, and no one's interfering with that. And then he kind of extrapolates that idea to say leaders should not be elected. Leaders should be chosen for their qualifications. And like an example that I've heard is you wouldn't ask a doctor to fly a plane. You wouldn't ask a pilot to, suture a wound. No, you would ask the pilot to pilot a plane, and you ask the doctor to suture your wounds. So then he takes that and he kind of explains, okay, your leaders should not be the popular ones or who the masses decide. They should be the most qualified. And then in this case, he said they should be philosophers. So with this...
I wonder why he said that.
Right, yeah. So I guess let's just start from there. What do you guys kind of think of this concept? And we'll just go around. So go ahead, Peyton. We'll start with you again.
Yeah. That's interesting because, well, what's going to inspire somebody to vote for a candidate? Most people aren't of the philosopher archetype or the archetype that can easily understand the kind of abstractions that philosophy brings about. And, as I've talked about many times, philosophy is my big thing, and I really appreciate those realms of abstraction because I think that they lead to a lot more nuance and a lot more productivity once we get closer to the world of the physical, right? So in my head, intuitively, in a vacuum, I would agree with Plato.
Sure.
You want somebody who can have the most abstract, narrowed down into specificity understanding of their country or society, whatever they're representing, to do the best decisions for the most people. But practically speaking, as I said earlier, the average person is not so philosophically inclined. It's not appealing to them. And so I think we have one of two options if we go with Plato's route. We have option one, we neglect the people's who don't understand philosophy because, like, if they can't comprehend it, their vote shouldn't matter, which I think it's dangerous really quickly. Or option two, we don't vote for the philosophers. We just continue to, accept the people voting for what they think matters, which we hear more voices, but are they the best voices? That's a weird gray area that I'd like to get into. But
Sure.
What about you, Mac? What do you think?
I would say conceptually, I agree with Plato, that like meritocracy argument of like you want the people leading who are the most equipped to lead.
Right.
But I think also, I'm like fairly certain during Athenian democracy, they were running 1-year terms. I know it was in Rome, and I know the Roman system was based off the Greek system. So I'm going to guess the Greek system. And like, that's a situation where like I understand the argument because you're burning through politicians so fast. But I think in American democracy, because I'm assuming we're centering this American.
Yes.
I think then the argument can be made a little bit more for like the average person, like a diaspora of people, because we have a pretty large like House of Reps.
Sure.
Like you want a lot of voices. You don't just want the philosophers. You don't just want the lawyers. Is probably the like modern day. That's probably the more accurate like equivalent to the Plato philosopher argument.
Right.
So I think there's good and bad to that argument.
Yeah.
And kind of like you were saying, like on paper it works. On paper it makes sense, but I think practically it kind of falls apart.
Yeah, you guys bring up a great point, and Peyton, you mentioned like in a vacuum, it sounds great, but if you were to try to sort of employ this, you'd be ignoring like, well, for one, human nature, for two, the complexity that is politics, especially American politics in recent times. It would not work very well. Okay, good. And actually, I was thinking with the Athenian thing, I want to say I read something where they would just kind of like go in a circle type of thing. It was like, okay, you're the leader now, but they're all like sort of the same. I don't know.
Yeah, that's actually where we get the word dictator from, because it comes from like speaker, like dictate. It was just the speaker of the house.
Right, yeah.
And then, yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, before I move on, any of you have any thoughts, any questions towards one another?
I'm just curious where you're going.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Yeah.
It's just sort of an open discussion. Okay. So let's kind of move towards our more personal opinions. Just kind of broadly, what do you think of democracy? Obviously, it's kind of hard. We don't really know any better or have much comparison. I guess I'll start. So democracy to me is obviously very good. It's not perfect, but I know it's probably one of the better means of governance, especially being a big country that we are. I think it's probably our best option as far as a form of government. And I with that, I think it makes the most sense, being that we have, like 330 million people? Is that right?
Yeah. Maybe more, yeah.
Something like that, yeah. So it's insane. I think rule by people is the only option that we have, being such a big country, both by landmass and by population. I don't see a world where anything else really sticks or works. And we'll kind of get to that later on. So let's switch it up. Mac, we'll start with you now.
Oh, on the spot. I agree with you. I think democracy has its faults. It's not a perfect system 100% of the time, but no rule of government really is. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. Well, I don't want to say they all have their strengths. They all have their weaknesses. Yeah, like in America, like the Electoral College, not the greatest system,
right.
But it's so hard to govern that many people. And like also kind of bringing it back to Plato, he was talking about like that small, like Athenian democracy was basically at the level of like a semi-large city. Like it's a lot easier to govern a smaller amount of people.
I think they call it like a city-state or something like
that.
Yeah.
And so I think in terms of like the large countries in the world today, democracy makes the most sense and leads to probably a net positive overall.
Okay.
Yeah, I broadly agree with you all. Go democracy, go representation. I'm very big on this idea of liberalism. Free speech, free marketplace of ideas, and that goes very well with democracy, I think. Not only is democracy just good, because like you prefaced, that's all we know, right? So we might be a little inclined to support it more, but I think that certain forms of government need to be structured in a utilitarian kind of way. If we're governing, upwards 330 million people, right? you want to have the most good for the most people. And I think that out of all the governments that we have tried, democracy is the best and most successful at that so far, even though it's definitely not perfect.
Right.
But yeah, I'm all for it. It's definitely a fragile system, as we may or may not have seen early in 2020. But yeah.
2021.
Oh, it's 20.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. Late 2020, early 2021.
Yeah, and to kind of give an example of like, there are flaws in democracy. You brought up the Electoral College. The founders literally said, okay, I don't think we trust the American people to actually make the right decision. So that's where the idea of the Electoral College comes from, and that now it's just a formality. So really, it kind of defeats the purpose. Okay, cool. Let's see, where do I want to go with this next? So let's talk about sort of the origins of democracy from an American standpoint. So the American experiment. Kind of give your personal definitions of what is the American experiment to you guys. And,
You go first.
Yeah, whoever.
Okay. I should have a better answer for this because this is basically my major. But I would say from the American standpoint, democracy is that like sort of the trial run. I don't want to say the U.S. was the first to do democracy. That's not true. But they were arguably the first to do it on such a large scale. And in a very different time period. Like the Electoral College is a remnant of 3/4 of the population not being literate.
Right.
Like, so I think American democracy is sort of like the proto-democracy because it was heavily inspired by like a representative system rather than like straight democracy.
Sure.
And it has its strengths and its weaknesses, but I think you have to give the American system a lot of credit for being the first to try it on such a large scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Another key point to kind of build off of that is the fact that that same system is functionally what we have today. Like the founding fathers were so particular and educated in how they created that structure such that it literally works mostly with some kinks, but for 330 million people now. And I think that's a real testament to the things that people were able to understand and reflect on back in 1760s. I'm happy it happened, and I wonder what would have happened if we didn't have democracy until a point where everyone was literate, right?
Yeah.
Where maybe we could theoretically have that kind of Plato philosopher ruler. And maybe even now if people end up being more educated. But as it stands now, given everything that they had access to, I think it was an amazing experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there are some interesting questions on why did the Revolutionary War happen. I've seen some interesting books on that. That's sort of irrelevant as far as like the decision to kind of create what is our government. And there's a lot of inspiration that comes from like things like the Magna Carta, John Locke. Life, liberty, and property was his kind of three things, and then we just switched out pursuit of happiness. And
because of slaves.
Well, yeah. I've actually heard an interesting argument that we may have made that change just because it sounds better, like just rolls out the tongue a little bit better. So that's kind of funny. You brought up Peyton, like glad it happened. Obviously, it's a great thing. We're doing a pretty good job. What do you guys think as far as it being sort of an experiment that there may be some sort of end to this? Peyton, we'll start with you.
That is a very interesting point. I mean, in recent years, the question I've heard floated around pretty often is, can a democracy vote itself out of existence? And I don't quite have an answer for that yet.
Give it a month.
Yeah, give it a month. Wait until November 5th, everybody. But
Sorry.
Oh, you're good. On one hand, it's been going on for, 250, 300 years now, something like that?
We're approaching 250.
Approaching 250. Yeah. So it's been kicking for a while. And I like to be hopeful about that. But at the same time, it's been goofy the past couple of years. People are entertaining other systems that might be better for more people. People don't understand any of the systems that are in play right now and can't appreciate them accordingly. So it's definitely a worrying time. Go vote, everybody. Go vote.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree with the go vote thing. No, future-wise for American democracy, I mean, I don't want to sound like an alarmist, but I kind of agree with you. I think you'll know a lot more about the future of American democracy in a month.
Yeah.
I think, like, not to be like every election is the most important election of
Right.
your life, but this one is like, I think
It's up there.
It's up there because it definitely has the chance to set a precedent for things.
For sure.
But I think longer term, there's an argument to be made that historically speaking, such a large, broad coalition of basically independent governments really struggles to stay together. I mean, like, I know the U.S. is a lot more unified than, say, like the Soviet Union.
Sure.
But, like, as time goes on, like, people from California are going to start identifying less and less with, like, somebody from Georgia. And I don't want to say civil war, but
Right,
I think there's an argument to be made that probably not even in our lifetime, 100, 200 years from now, every state will function. I think it's going to go the extremes. It's either going to become way more unified as a country or way more state-based.
Okay.
Just because I think the kind of delicate balance we're playing isn't super.
It's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable long term, especially because like you think about like California is way farther away from New York than like Spain is from Germany.
Yeah.
But like as time goes on, those two groups become more and more separate, heritage-wise, culturally, economically, even. So I think there's an argument to me that the American experiment will end when every state kind of takes hold of its own democracy. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but I think it definitely could happen.
Well, and there's a point too, like America, your average citizen, like we're so much different from one another, and we've been getting more and more different from each other, like as the years have gone by. So it's becoming harder for the government to kind of appeal to the majority because that majority is thinning, and all these minority groups, which obviously is a good thing to have. I mean, I don't know what the hell else we would do. It's kind of taking away from the majority. And there's nothing inherently wrong about that, but it creates an issue for the government. So it's now, okay, how exactly do we go about doing things when the majority is becoming not the majority? There really is no, main majority. It's it's thinning. And that's also why, and this kind of ties into more of the economic side, that's why places like Norway or Sweden, they're excellent because there's so few people and they're all like very, very much the same. So it's much easier for them to govern themselves and also, from an economic standpoint, redistribute wealth. That's why it works because, they're small in population. They're very much the same. It's a lot easier. So is there an end to the American experiment? I would say obviously yes. We've seen glimpses of that, even far back, obviously the Civil War. That was a very, very, we were close to losing American democracy. 2021 showed some glimpses of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, this next election will be very, very determinative of our future, I think. Okay, cool. Anything else you guys want to discuss as far as democracy goes?
I can't think of anything. I feel like there should be more, but I can't think of anything right now.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
It's like such a complex topic, but like, what the hell else do we talk about?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yay democracy.
Go America. Okay, so let's start kind of transitioning now to economics. So we talked about capitalism. We kind of gave our definitions. Let's just start kind of what do you see as some potential flaws with capitalism? And I'll start. And maybe this is kind of unique to America. Maybe it's not necessarily a capitalism thing, but we very much prioritize the CEOs, the large business owners, and maybe rightly so. They probably create the most value out of your average citizen. But we're doing that at the expense of the working class. So I would like if we have a system, and again, maybe this isn't, exclusive to capitalism. I would like if we could have a system where we reward people making the most value without taking away from those who aren't necessarily creating as much value. So that's something I see as a flaw, at least in American capitalism. And I don't know how in the world we would necessarily fix that. I know minimum wage is a common argument, but I'd have to see kind of the results of that before I really have a huge opinion on that. That's a major flaw I see, and I guess why don't we go around again, and I'll think of some more.
Sure. So for me, it's complicated. So I'll be a little personal with it, okay? College student, my parents make decent amounts of money, but because of that, they also have a decent amount of expenses. And so I'm working on my own. After I pay rent and, well, actually that's it. Yeah, I pay rent. I'm still struggling to afford food, and God knows that I have not paid this semester's tuition yet. And previously, I would have identified with this idea of the middle class. I mean, I'm getting educated. I have technology. I have this opportunity that so many others don't have to record a podcast talking about economic opportunity, right? And I recognize that. But at the same time, I'm in this really weird gray area where sometimes eating isn't as often as I'd like it to be, And I feel like this is a pretty common experience, at least more common than it should be amongst more people as time goes on. So for me, the critical flaw in capitalism is, while I do recognize the fact that it certainly can provide doorways of opportunity to people, not everybody will be able to fit through those doorways. And so we see ourselves with a big disparity of too many people who can't support themselves, and too many people, although it's a smaller margin, who can support themselves, and others way over but don't. And while I do think that the middle version of capitalism, where people can support themselves but also, keep contributing value, I think that's good. But if we can find a way to kind of even out those extremes of the people who need support and people who have too much, it'd be a lot stronger of a system. But then I don't know how far away from capitalism that gets.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there's kind of like two sides. If you're rich, generally it is pretty hard to get unrich. Like, you have to be incredibly dumb to lose that rich status. Yeah. And on the other side of that coin, if you're poor, it is incredibly hard to be not poor. Like, there's so little that you can do. And just how many homeless people are in the U.S.? It's
too many.
Yeah. It's a crazy amount. It's like,
and even if you're like middle class, it's really easy to fall into the poverty. Like,
for sure.
I just saw a stat the other day, so this is going to be a little bit wrong numbers-wise, but it's emotionally correct. It's something like, I want to say 1 in 3 people could not afford like a $3,000 medical bill right now. And like, in a system where we don't, in a system where we don't have like public health care, that's like not the fault of somebody for falling and breaking a leg.
Yeah.
So I like, getting back to the capitalism question, I think American capitalism especially really, really, how do I phrase this, likes to put the needs of the very rich first. Mm-hmm. And that's probably sort of a recent development, kind of the Reagan era shift further from social safety nets and more towards like free market. Like unfettered capitalism.
Yeah, thanks for that trickle down, by the way. Totally worked.
Yeah. God, I'm getting trickled on so much. But I think there is a place for capitalism that works for people. I mean, yeah, we had problems in the 50s with race and stuff, but I think economically it was because we were feeling those like New Deal era policies where that's still capitalism.
Right.
But you have the social safety nets, you have the you have regulations on mega corporations. FDR was big on breaking up monopolies, and I think that like we feel that today, like the monopolies and the oligopolies really kind of control our economic situation right now.
Yeah, and like what you're bringing up, that almost makes me think it's more of a political issue than necessarily an economic one. So, like as an example, you have the rich, they own companies or have some sort of purpose or agenda, and then you get to lobbyists. Lobbyists are kind of an issue. God. I mean, in the past they've represented some good things. I mean, I think Lincoln was the a pretty big figure that used lobbyists to his advantage in Congress. But now you have at the point where the rich have the most power in Congress. They don't even necessarily have to have any ties with Congress. They can just say, hey, you're a lobbyist now. I'm going to pay you, $1 million. Go tell this guy to vote this way. And I've actually seen, I don't even remember what the context was, but it was like former members of Congress can get paid to be a lobbyist because they have that experience, they have those relationships.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most common jobs after you leave Congress is to become a lobbyist.
Wow.
So to that point, I think it's more of a political issue rather than maybe a capitalism issue. And then by extension, it's an American capitalism issue. So I guess what do you guys think about that sort of perspective? And we'll start with you.
Yeah, like I kind of prefaced, I do think that middle version of capitalism for the middle class, if that even exists, it's kind of weird and subdivided right now. But I think that that's good enough. Like you said, most can't afford, 1 in 3 can't afford that $3,000 medical bill. And I think if we can find a way, probably legislatively, not through overworking the economic system entirely, but legislatively to bring people up to a point where they can have that kind of thing, be it with a public safety net or somehow increasing wages without decimating inflation. I know this is a very difficult, complicated system to handle. Then I think capitalism is pretty good, but it's a matter of how we legislatively deal with the ramifications we experience today.
Yeah. On that same kind of idea, I tend to frame a lot of issues through politics. As a poli-sci major. It's kind of my job, but also it's just kind of who I am as a person. I like to find approaches, and kind of similar idea. I think to fix economic issues, it tends to be through policies, especially in a system where we ideally want to be free market capitalism.
Right.
But we know from experience that doesn't work all the time. You need some guardrails. You need some regulations. You need OSHA. Free market capitalism wouldn't have OSHA. Right. So I think kind of getting back on that idea of capitalism can be good. It can work for the majority of people, but we have to be careful about thinking capitalism is the answer versus capitalism is the framework that we need to kind of guide in a way to help as many people as possible.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you both. So from that, are there any realistic sort of alternatives to capitalism? And oh boy, as an example, with kind of what we talked about Plato and his idea of governing, his ideas sound great on paper, but in practice, maybe not. And a great example of that is communism. Communism is the sort of ideal economic system on paper, but no one has been able to make it work. So I'll turn it over to you guys. What is a possible alternative? Is it realistic? And in what world would we make that change?
Yeah, no, I got so excited there because I wanted to do exactly what you just said, which is communism, but it only works on paper. Yeah. And in my, again, I don't study economics, so I don't know the ins and outs. I haven't read Marx yet. But in my understanding, it only works if every single person involved has honestly and truly believes in the intentions and reasonings for being a communist. Because the second you have anybody who disagrees or thinks otherwise, then they're going to start becoming greedy or otherwise turn away from the system and start hoarding wealth, and then that disparity ends up showing up. So I do think this kind of meme of a commune out in the mountains of just an isolated group of people, as long as they're not messing with anybody outside and they all genuinely believe in the cause and the reasonings, then I think it can work. But the bigger we make the system, even 1,000 people, let alone the population size of a country, gets far less likely to work because it's just human nature for people not to want to
absolutely.
I don't know, compromise, I guess, especially at least in this American capitalist system. That's just not something we want to do. It can get very stagnant. But I think in isolated situations it can work, though.
Yeah. Real quickly, you bring up a good point, and we kind of talked about this a little bit. It can work. Will it? That's a whole other question.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, go ahead.
Kind of agree with you on everything you said. Like you both said, communism theoretically should be the perfect economic system. but we know in practice that doesn't really work. Now, granted, we haven't really had a true communist country that hasn't been meddled with outside influences. Like Cuba, like I believe Castro was a communist and would have stuck to pretty idyllic communist ideals. But then he was so economically sanctioned that it's hard to really know if that's true.
Yeah.
But like, I think practically the more attainable solution would be something closer to socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Like you still have those capitalist leanings. You know, there's still a marketplace. There's still, you know, you still exchange money, that sort of thing. But like the things that you need to survive are not in that marketplace. You know, healthcare, housing, that's food, like that sort of thing. And I think to me at least, that's attainable. That's possible. I mean, there's a lot of countries that do parts of that. Canada has a great public healthcare system. I don't want to say great. There's problems with it, but it has a public healthcare system. There's countries that have, like Austria has a really strong public housing system. Like there's ways to do these things. The question of if you can do it at 330 million is another question, but I think it is possible.
Yeah.
It'd be hard.
For sure, yeah. And like the problem from an American standpoint, again, goes back to we're so big, there's so many of us, it's so hard to do something like that. But with that, and you brought up socialism, we are, I don't want to say we're moving towards a more socialized sort of society, because I think FDR was, like his kind of plans was very socialized, and then we moved a little bit away from that, now we're sort of moving back towards that. So from a political standpoint, why do you guys think, you know, the term socialized or socialism has been like kind of very much like demonized, if that's the right word, demonized, or like very much attacked, particularly by the right, and like as an example, like if someone is like critical of socialism and you ask them to define socialism, very rarely can they actually define it. So kind of what do you guys think is sort of the root cause of that, and like from a political standpoint?
You want to take it?
Well, for one, it's good politics. If a demon word is always nice to throw around, especially one that's, at least to your supporters, is very nebulous and hard to define. It's easy to stick on people. Two, big business corporations, the rich, don't like socialism. Like they prefer like more towards the akin of like the free market, unfettered. So like they're throwing money at candidates saying, so then it does turn into a dirty word to like a certain subsect of people. And when you have people that you trust, like in politics, throwing it around as an insult, you tend to think of it as an insult.
Right.
And also economic theory is very complicated. I don't know much about it. I like to think I do, but I don't. And so it's easy to call a certain economic system like blanketly bad or blanketly evil, and a lot of people will just kind of agree with you because it's hard to digest it all. For sure.
And like that's more than just economics too. There's plenty of things that you could say this is bad, and like most people are like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think I agree with everything there, but I want to add something else that I think is kind of integral to specifically socialism being demonized. Is it's just equivocated with communism all the time. There's a long line of equivocations happening. So socialism equals communism, communism equals Russia, Russia equals enemy, equals China, China equals enemy. And so there's so many equivocations happening to get that effect of a demon word, right? Socialism. And at the end of the day, if we look at these actual definitions, what they'd actually look like, no, there's a lot more nuance to everything. China is a country. They have lots of people in the country, and the people may not all hate America. The government probably does, and I think it's safe to hate the Chinese government, same with Russia government. But it's this idea of equivocation, such that especially today in the right, and maybe a little bit on the left too, if you're a little cautious and want to be more capitalist, it's just this idea of not having the opportunity to actually learn what socialism actually is or what communism actually is because of this long line of connotations that we've been developing over the past 100 years or so.
Yeah. And it goes back to kind of the government thing is the American people are very dumb.
Yes.
Like on a very broad level. And I think a way that we can sort of generalize this is like we're not saying like these systems will work or that they are the best. We're saying, they're worth talking about. I mean, like with the whole Plato thing, to us his arguments are, while interesting, obviously don't work because we talked about the whole on paper versus in practice, but they're worth discussing, and that goes with all ideas, and that kind of goes like what we're doing here. Some ideas have mixed levels of merit to them, but it's worth talking about all of them because, well, one, it's fair, and two, it helps us kind of realize how good we have it compared to other countries and other peoples, and B, sort of the reasons why we have some of these things. So I guess kind of, and Peyton, I'll start with you. What's kind of your take on that, and like how can we kind of relate this discussion to what we're doing, particularly as a Discourse series?
Yeah. Well, as a preface, I think we're both, or all three of us, sorry, I'm so used to only being two of us.
You're good.
I think everybody in here is like democratic in the sense of like we like that government, and at least to some extent capitalists, right? But we can still talk about other ideas and other things. And the hardest part about that is without those connotations I was talking about earlier. In our media cycles today, echo chambers today, that's almost impossible to find if you don't go out of your way and to some extent even get lucky with the things you have access to. But this talk about democracy and capitalism and what we've been doing with our podcast, what we do with our internship here, UA Discourse series, is trying to eliminate the stigma, the connotations that come with complex and quite frankly important ideas. But because of those connotations, nobody can really fairly engage with these things. And it's only through engaging with these things that we can have a working democratic system, because we have everybody fairly exchanging ideas and synthesizing, hopefully, a better future for everybody.
For sure. Yeah, and like what you bring up is like, it almost feels like you're not allowed to talk about things that don't align with like the mainstream. Like with what you were saying, with the whole lobbyists and stuff, like people don't want you talking about anti-capitalism ideas because it goes against their interest. And it feels like that's kind of expanded from, just an economic standpoint to like everything. Like if you're in I don't know, if you're in a particularly pro-life area, you're not allowed to talk about pro-choice. Like you're just not. Yeah. And like that idea has just been so extrapolated and like enlarged that like the discussions are just so rare now. And there's a lot of blame to go around. Social media is a big thing. The media in general is a big proponent of that. And again, that obviously ties back to what we're doing here. Mac, obviously you're not necessarily affiliated with Discourse series, but like I guess from a societal standpoint, kind of what's your take on that?
I would sort of refute what you just said, because I think in many ways social media has actually acted against that idea. Like, I know this is a little more of a personal example, but like the most left-leaning like major media you can get is probably MSNBC, which globally is like left, but like not super left. But like TikTok, for example, spans every end. There's news creators who are communists, and there's news creators who are the like full free market capitalists, like oppose OSHA even sort of things. So I think in many ways, like the barrier to entry for media has lowered, and I think that has increased the variety in media you can consume, but also it comes at a cost of it's like super easy now to find yourself in an echo chamber because like the algorithms, they want you to watch, they want you to stay. So you tend to not watch things you disagree with.
Right.
So I think it's a double-edged sword, but I think in many ways social media has sort of helped to cut down that stigma of like you can't talk about anything that is against the 1% or that sort of thing.
I would probably agree with you if not for our good old friend Elon Musk and Twitter. I refuse to call it X. I'm never calling it X now. It's Twitter.
It's a dumb name.
It's so dumb. Yeah, I would probably agree with you, but Twitter has become so bad now, and obviously it's one platform, but it's very widespread, and like a lot of people use it. And also, like, not just Twitter, but like in general, like across social media, I think the quality of politics and the quality of political discussions on social media has very much declined. I don't think it was ever really that good in the first place. So I guess that would kind of be my argument against what you're saying. Maybe, and we've talked about this at one point. Yes, political opinions, and there's a very wide spectrum, are available, but it's sometimes hard to find that, and maybe that's sometimes not your fault. Like
Yeah.
you mentioned the algorithm and such. So that would kind of be what I would say, but on most of the other points, I would probably agree with you.
Yeah.
Low key, I want to contest that.
Okay.
It is a double-edged sword, but I do think the algorithms specifically are what makes it a very long sword on one side. Because you're right, a vast spectrum of opinions do exist online, but our like culture as like a people right now is very anti-opposition. We like to be comfortable. We don't like worrying. We don't like cognitive dissonance. And the algorithms reflect that. And so as soon as you start somewhere with something you're already comfortable with, I believe the algorithms so heavily reinforce that to where it's very hard to break out if you don't want to. And why would you want to if you don't have exposure to other options, right? So I think it takes, well, my solution for everything, granted it might be naive, but I also want to be a professor, so I do want to act upon this, is this idea of education, just exposing people to more ideas such that they can at least critically think about them. And the algorithms right now kind of destroy that aspect of that information availability to me, if that makes sense.
The one thing I would say about algorithms, and I'll use Twitter as an example again, which, you know,
It's
kind of an
popular
outlier,
example.
but there was this article written about this guy that created a new account, and like it had zero political affiliations or anything like that. Like his account was like, I don't even know what it was. It was like gaming or something, and he was like continuously being fed like right-wing content in his like notifications and his feed and stuff, despite having like never interacted with that or like followed anyone that like participated in that and such. And again, Twitter is obviously like a very kind of like over here example, especially since Musk meddled in that. But that's where I would kind of say it's not always you that's fueling the algorithm. It's sometimes external factors.
True.
Mm-hmm. And there's even an example on the totally opposite end of that spectrum too. Like, go to your Instagram settings right now. If you want political stuff, you have to manually turn it on. It's a couple months ago, Meta changed their user agreement that by default turned off anything they called like controversial, which was like anything political, anything to do with any like movements or anything. So if you've noticed on Instagram, you've probably seen less of it. It's because it's actively getting suppressed.
Interesting.
Wow.
So like that's like the total opposite end of that.
Yeah.
Instead of like hard promoting one side, it's just like a complete removal of politics, which I think is irresponsible too.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of relates to the idea, and you sort of acknowledge this, like, no matter what the topic is, there is like an underlying kind of political question about that. And I like that. And I think you said you like that because that's what I'm about. But for most of society, that's probably not a good thing. There's a lot of people that don't like politics. And, because things have been so politicized, they're sort of, shunning that. And maybe that kind of ties into what Meta is doing and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's definitely interesting.
Well, that leads me to one question that's kind of off topic, but I'm curious. So both of you say that you view most things, if not all, through this realm of or lens of politics, right? For me, the answer is the same, except substitute politics with philosophy, right?
Sure.
Because I think that's the most foundational thing, most personal thing, and often most consistent thing if you have the right frameworks and understandings. And that's where I get my politics from. Now, granted, part of it's me not doing enough research on actual real world politics, right? But I am a little less educated than I imagine you two are on the actual systems, the actual events. But I think at least, in the abstract realms, I have a very firm understanding of political things and other things by virtue of that philosophical understanding. So I was curious, maybe for yourselves personally or for the average person, what role do you think philosophy does and or should play in one's political views and how they found them?
That's interesting. And maybe, I guess I'm not going to necessarily tie that to my own beliefs, but like, who was it? I think we even talked about this last week. Was it Hobbes that was saying separation of powers isn't a good idea? I think it was.
It may have been.
I don't even remember. But I guess as far as my own personal beliefs, I'm not really big into philosophy. I don't understand it very well. When I've been asked to read it for like I think it was like a Western Civ class or something like that. I was like, okay, some of this is very interesting, but I don't really see the real purpose behind it. And I think I would assume that most people sort of align with kind of that, what I was just saying. I don't, my sort of political ideals come from, I guess, the environment around me, but also not because I was very like conservative that was around me. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm a weird case. I don't know.
Well, you're an important case, and I think that
Yeah.
that idea of like how is philosophy applicable? You do have to take a lot of very how do I say difficult roads to realize how it might be, and I have to put might be in there, right? But yeah, Mac, what do you think?
I'm kind of the same thing. I'm not super into philosophy, but I do see its benefits. To me, philosophy lays a good framework for like how I would want to like guide policy. Like I think they kind of have to go hand in hand. Like you can't have policy, like good policy, without thinking of like the morality or
Right.
like very basic utilitarianism, which has its benefits, has its cons, and is super applicable to politics and to government.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the greatest philosophical question, at least from a political standpoint, is what is justice? And I think that's kind of been like our sort of driving force, not even just American politics, but like just governance in general, forward, backwards, sideways. That's kind of been like sort of our driving factor.
Damn, I really want to. I don't know how much time we have. I really want to destroy the idea of justice really quick.
Oh, God. We can maybe
do that another time. But
okay.
well, yeah. What do you think?
Yeah. Anything else that either of you want to explore regarding democracy, capitalism?
I have a lot to learn. Evidently, I may have convictions, but yeah, they're like how physically like our government works, all of the people involved, all of the staff, all the systems. It's a lot to begin to understand, and I haven't even started on that road, and most Americans haven't. But I do think a world where we can start exposing people to that, people will come to appreciate our systems a lot more, and that goes for capitalism as well. And maybe if you're bored, go look up who the Speaker of the House is right now, what their actual name is, and then slowly but surely you'll start to understand how the processes work, and maybe grow to appreciate them more. And maybe if you're extra kooky with it, you'll find out reasons not to like it, and maybe come up with something better.
I think you'll often find more reasons not to like it than reasons to like it.
Fair enough.
That's true.
Well, and there's something there that I kind of want to touch on, and maybe this wasn't exactly what you're saying, but it created a spark in my mind. Is like the structure of our government, I think, is very good. More often than not, the people in our government are not very good.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting kind of topic there, but Mac?
Kind of the same thing. And I think structure a lot of the times is more important than people, because structure tends to last longer. But I think there's good and bad to being really invested in politics. Because sometimes it can make you feel really hopeless when you're one of 330 million people,
Right.
and it feels like you're the only one that sees something so obviously wrong. But I think more people understanding how government works, understanding how democracy and capitalism really function, but also coming to their own conclusions about that. I think sometimes the danger of education is we kind of fall into the same thoughts. But I think just being more involved, being more open-minded, being more willing to change your views if new evidence arises is the most important thing, probably.
Yeah, I agree. That was kind of a closing thoughts, but any closing thoughts?
What about you?
I don't have much else to say. I mean, you guys put it pretty well.
Perfect.
This is kind of an abstract topic, but sometimes those abstract topics are the most worth discussing, kind of as we talked about a little bit. The values that we have in this country, and like we kind of both mentioned, we don't know a whole lot much better or different, but exploring those topics are important. Not just these topics, but in general, like anything. These discussions are healthy. for a lot of reasons. So, yeah, I'm glad we could have this. Mac, I'm glad you could be with us.
Glad to be here.
That's all I've got.
Yeah.
So,
Perfect.
Peyton, why don't you close us out?
Gladly. Thank you guys for joining us again for episode 6 of Discourse Debrief. Mac, it's been an honor. Thank you so much for showing up. Ted was right. You were very well spoken. Lots of potential that's already actuated. So thank you again for sharing your opinions with us.
Thanks for having me.
But yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning here, probably an hour ago, but we've got some events coming up. One's on election night, some afterwards, some before that'll be uploaded, hopefully already. But until next time, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks, guys.
Goodbye.